So, good evening. I'm Tim O'Shea, Principal of the University of Edinburgh, and it's a tremendous pleasure to welcome you to our lecture today, which is, in fact, International Women's Day. I'm really pleased to see so many people here. A very appropriate setting with, you notice, our deities on either side, with clutching their spears and wisdom. Millions of women worldwide are committed to improving the health, education, and prosperity of future generations. The university is delighted to take this opportunity to celebrate the contribution of women to civil society. The lecture this evening is the first of an annual lecture series in the university to mark International Women's Day. This evening's lecture will be introduced and chaired by the distinguished radio and television journalist Sheena MacDonald. She is widely known for her work on current affairs, the arts and religion. She is presently engaged in developing digital web TV channels. One of our graduates, she was also awarded an honorary degree in 2001. It's a pleasure to hand over to Sheena. Please.
International Women's Day has just celebrated. Well, this is the 100th year. Formerly, there was a kind of dry run in the United States in 1909, but in Copenhagen, they got going with the first formal International Women's Day. So for me, it's a huge privilege to... actually, before I say that, I should say that women in Edinburgh have traditionally been at the forefront of movements that recognise and celebrate women's contributions internationally, nationally, and locally. Therefore, it's a great privilege for me to steer us through this inaugural lecture in the centenary year, the Edinburgh University International Women's Day lecture, and to introduce to you an exceptional woman, Harriet Lamb. She's so exceptional that I could use up all the time she has to speak, giving you her CV. So I shall simply say that she's Executive Director for the Fairtrade Foundation and has been since 2001. And on her watch, Fairtrade, as you know, has grown, has mushroomed from being a somewhat politically correct minority eco-brand patronised by Guardian reading do-gooders to what it is today, which is a global front-runner, which is pioneering commercial and trade policies in a benign yet revolutionary manner. Many of us have personally just marked Fairtrade Fortnight, which has just ended. All of us want to know a lot more about the whats and the wheres and the whys that Harriet Lamb is doing and planning. There'll be ample opportunity for you to ask questions after we've heard from her. But let me first invite you to welcome Harriet Lamb.
Good evening, everybody, and happy International Women's Day to you all. And it's a real pleasure to be here to mark it with you here at the University of Edinburgh. And last year was quite a year in the USA, wasn't it? Firstly, and most importantly, obviously, there was the death of Michael Jackson. Now, personally, I zoned out of Michael Jackson when he started dangling babies out of windows. But in the past year, I have rediscovered the powerful social messages in his music. For example, The Man in the Mirror, in which the words are, if you want to see that change, make that change. I'm starting with the man in the mirror. If you want to make the world a better place, start with that face. I'm starting with the man in the mirror. A startling message of personal social responsibility. And the story of Fairtrade is precisely the story of millions of ordinary people throughout the world creating change by starting with themselves and their own shopping or their own businesses and working in networks and creating the space within which businesses can take big, bold decisions that changed the very way that they buy products from developing countries, such that today some 7.5 million farmers, workers and their families across the developing world are now involved and benefiting from fair trade. Now, of course, there was another big event in the US last year, which was obviously the election of Barack Obama. And I don't know about you, but I really miss George Bush. He was so funny. And my favourite was when he complained that too many imports into this country come from abroad. And on the basis of that in-depth understanding of world trade, then declared that he would fight aggressively for free trade, which indeed he did, so long it was about other countries opening their markets to US goods. Well, meanwhile, he continued and indeed deepened US subsidies, for example, to its cotton farmers, who then produced too much cotton, which they then dumped on world markets, which has then been shown by the World Bank, no less, to be directly related to reducing the price going to West African cotton farmers by at least 10%, which is why today the farmers there are so poor that their children have to walk 10 miles to get to school. And I don't know about you, but I think it's quite hard to get your kids to walk 10 minutes to school. But that is the kind of injustice in trade that fair trade seeks to challenge and to change. And so Obama's actually not nearly as funny, let's be honest. In fact, the funniest thing I heard that he had done was actually to pull up all the rose bushes in the White House garden. And at first I thought, oh, that's because he's so committed to fair trade. He wants to only have fair trade roses from Kenya. Actually, it turns out that's not the reason. The reason is he wants to be really, really sure there are no more bushes in the White House. And at his inaugural address this time a year ago, more or less, Obama said, "The success of our economy has always depended not just on the size of our GDP, but on the reach of our prosperity, on the ability to extend opportunity to every willing heart, not out of charity, but it is the surest route to our common good." And that surely, too, is the essence of fair trade, to put people first, because it is in our common good to do that, and also because it is the right thing to do. And I actually think basically the public here in Edinburgh and indeed throughout the country are fundamentally very decent. We all love a bargain. If someone says, "Do you two for the price for one?" or "Isn't this cheap?" of course people will snap it up. But when we know the true price of that bargain, then actually people are very decent and have said very loud and clear over the past years that actually, no, they want to embrace an alternative. And when the living alternative that is fair trade is made easy for them, they are absolutely ready to take it to heart. And it is worth spending just a couple of minutes looking at why we need fair trade. These are graphs from the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, which show you what's happened in real terms to the prices of commodities over the past 40 years. Take coffee, sugar, cocoa, rubber, jute, rice, cotton, tea, bananas. I could go on and on and on all evening, and that is what fair trade seeks to challenge and to change, because behind each of those graphs lie the lives of millions of farmers and workers who've seen the price that they get paid for their goods fall and fall and fall. And you can't make those kind of price cuts in our supermarkets and the price you pay to the farmers without those farmers feeling the cost. And I personally first got hooked on fair trade when I visited a banana plantation in Costa Rica many years ago. And I was investigating what was the impact of those kind of price cuts in our supermarkets for the farmers and the workers on the plantations who grow bananas. And I met a woman called Maria, whose husband sprayed, without proper protection, pesticides on a banana called DBCP. It was in fact a pesticide that had been banned in the USA because it was known to cause sterility. But it was still being made and exported and used by US multinational companies on the banana plantations across Central America. Thousands of workers were left sterile. Maria was not so lucky. She gave birth to a little boy whose head was 4 times bigger than his body. And when I went to visit Maria, she had a video that she showed me. And this little boy looked like a little alien. He had no lips, no nose, no eyelids. In constant pain, he cried all the time. And worst of all, Maria said, was that, as a mother's instinct is, she said, if I went to cuddle him, it only made the pain and the crying worse. There was nothing I could do but cry with him. And I knew then, as I know now, there has to be a better way to trade. That it's not worth having bananas so cheap that any woman on the other side of the world has to pay such a high price. And that was how I first got involved, which was then the very new fair trade movement. And actually, because I'd got involved through the world of bananas, I actually then went to work for our international office in Bonn, and I had the fantastic title of Banana Coordinator. There aren't many people worldwide who can claim to have coordinated bananas. And actually, as it's International Women's Day, I will share with you a secret that the world of bananas is very dominated by men. And I think it actually really helped being a woman in that world. And I think it's something to do with the shape of bananas. It makes men feel very vulnerable. Well, this year we're celebrating 15 years of the fair trade mark here in Britain. So we're a teenager, still growing fast, still as angry and inclined to slam doors when facing injustices that still mar our trade in 2010, and still as passionate about creating positive change as ever. When we started, Michael Jackson was in the news and Brad Pitt was voted sexiest man alive. So no change there then. But in that time, we have seen a real quiet revolution on our shop shelves. From a time when, as Sheena said, people laughed at us as a niche for nutters and yogurt-weaving vicars, to today, when actually 9 out of 10 people bought a fair trade product last year. And when people have shown that actually they do care, and that today 30% of all the bananas that we buy in this country are now fair trade. And you can see here that rising graph, a testimony, really, to the decency of the public. And indeed, last year, in the teeth of the worst recession we've ever had, sales of fair trade products again rose by 12% to an estimated retail value of £800 million. And indeed, now today, there are over 4,000 products that you can buy, everything from ice cream to face cream, from fair trade tea to fair trade T-shirts, opening more doors for more farmers and workers in the developing world to sell their products on fair terms. And as you can see here, the graph showing the rising sales. And as you can see there, very much actually Latin America still among where the most fair trade producers are, but with more and more producers coming on from Africa. And we hope in the future we need to very much increase the producers from Asia as well. And there's a huge anecdotal body of evidence for story after story after story about the impact of fair trade for the farmers and workers across the developing world. And only earlier today, the university should be proud to host a fantastic coming together of people to think, how can we take fair trade forward in universities and colleges right across Scotland? And indeed, there was a representative of the Palestinian olive producers speaking about the difference that fair trade has made to them as individual farmers and to them working more collectively as a group and looking, in fact, about how the women can be more involved. Indeed, they're thinking of moving into selling olive paste. So there's any number of stories about the impact that fair trade can have, but it's also worth reflecting on the academic literature. And the Natural Resources Institute recently did a review of all the different academic studies that there have been of fair trade, and it narrowed it down to about 33 case studies looking at the impact for the fair trade communities. And it analysed the impact in a number of different ways. Firstly, there's the impact for the individual farmers and the difference that it's made to them. As one woman said to me, that now with fair trade, I can both send my children to school and put a main meal on the table at night. What would seem to us like we could take it for granted, making for those women all the difference in the world. But critically, always allied with that economic difference for the individuals is also the sense of dignity and empowerment that fair trade gives the farmers, because it's their product being sold for a fair price. As one banana farmer said to me, actually, I used to just be someone who loaded boxes of bananas onto a truck. That was the end of my responsibility. In this new system now, I'm an international businessman. Or as a woman on a tea estate in Sri Lanka explained to me, she was a worker, and she explained how when she saw the bosses coming, she used to jump into the tea bushes and hide until the managers had walked past on the path. Now, she says, I'm sitting round the table discussing with that same manager about how we invest the fair trade premium, whether we invest it in buying an ambulance so that women in labour can get to hospital quickly if they have complications, or whether we invest it in a small loan scheme so that people can grow vegetable gardens, or any number of ideas that she then collected from her fellow workers and took to the table to discuss and decide. And so fair trade's having an impact for individual men and women within their cooperative groups. And it's also having an impact for whole communities. So to go back to the story of cotton, as I mentioned, only 4 out of 10 children are in school in Mali because the price that the farmers get for their cotton is so low, and because it's the main export, the government has very little money as well. And so the very first thing that these cotton farmers did when they sold their first batch of cotton on fair trade terms was to build a school. So in year 1, they built 2 classrooms. But in no time at all, it was completely overflowing with all the kids who were hungry to learn. And so they introduced the shift system, but they still found that they were overflowing with kids. So the second year, when they were able to sell their cotton on fair trade terms, they used the premium to build 2 more classrooms. But by now, they were feeling much more confident of themselves, and they went to the government, and they insisted that the government also play its part. And now they have really a proper school that can service their village and all the villages surrounding whose children can now come to school. And that, again, is one of the differences that fair trade can make that was pinpointed by the academic studies, that it's not just the farmers who benefit from fair trade, that there are also benefits going wider throughout the community. And here's an example where the schools or the roads, investing in the environment or in health services are, of course, benefiting all those in the nearby community. And here one of the women explains that women now join in the decision-making. We're involved in the harvest and decisions about production and conservation. We were part of the decision to build a new school. Or as another woman said, fair trade has put money into the hands of women to meet our children's need. We can buy pens and notebooks so they can go to school. We have bought seeds and fertilizer to grow vegetables and improve our families' diets. And indeed, if you go to some of these villages, you can see the difference that the involvement of women in the decision-making is having, that in the traditional villages, the women are sitting at the very edge of the circle, at the back, if they're involved at all. Whereas if you go to the villages where they're talking about fair trade, it's the women are sitting right in the front of the semicircle and are very much making sure that their voice is heard in the decisions about how to invest the premium and indeed how to grow their organisations. So the other thing that these farmers did was to build a warehouse so that when they harvest their other crops They can keep it, they can store it, and wait till the price rises a little bit. The problem many poor farmers face is they have to sell their crop at the minute it's harvest when prices are always at their lowest. Whereas building a warehouse, they can store their produce, and when the price rises a little bit, they can then sell it for a much better return. And that is the empowerment that study after study by the Natural Resources Institute found was one of the biggest impacts of fair trade. That the price and the premium that farmers get for their fair trade produce has enabled the organisations actually to capitalise themselves, to increase productivity, to invest in quality, to invest perhaps in processing or in diversification away from their reliance just on one product. So to give you another story, this time from Rwanda, one of the poorest countries of the world, also, of course, not so long ago, embedded in conflict. And here's one of the coffee farmers from Maraba. And she explained how just coming out of the genocide, this village, Maraba village, was one of the poorest areas in the whole of Rwanda, and that actually people were literally dying of hunger. And they were simply harvesting their coffee and selling it to the first passing middleman who came to the village. It was called Café Ordinaire, and it was fetching less than ordinary prices. Now, through their involvement in fair trade, by working with the company Union Hand Roasted, who sell their coffee in, for example, Sainsbury's, this group of farmers are among the most dynamic and innovative farmers that I have ever met. They have invested back in improving the quality of their crop. They have built a washing station so they can add more value. They're going up the next stage of processing. They've also now, women that were the children of coffee farmers have now become cuppers. They're testing the coffee there, tasting it, and because they're doing it absolutely next to the farmers' fields, they're then immediately giving the feedback to the farmers so they can invest and go back in improving the quality. Now those farmers have won quality awards right across Africa for the quality of their Rwandan single origin coffee. Now these farmers are going organic and get a higher price. They've also invested in new agronomic practices. Really interestingly, they've actually imported Californian worms, which, despite their name, it turns out are really hard-working worms. You sort of imagine they might be lying around sunning themselves, but it turns out they're the hardest working worms you can get. And so they're using those worms to decompose the husks from the coffee and to use that as organic manure. And they're actually trialling ancient hand-roasting techniques in the village, and then they're selling their coffee in Rwanda itself. Really fantastic, innovative farmers investing back into their organisations and building up their businesses. And indeed, setting an example to other farmers. And it's often, many of the studies have found that actually the impact of fair trade always goes wider than just those farmers in the co-op. So the NRI, for example, cites that in Mexico, Tanzania, in Peru, in Ghana, in Bolivia, in Nicaragua, the fact that some farmers are selling on fair trade terms has helped raise the price for all producer organisations in an area. Because once other farmers get to know that some people are buying at the slightly higher price, then they also negotiate and bargain for that higher price, because they begin to understand more about what's happening to their coffee and where it's going. And they feel able then and empowered to argue for higher prices. In Tanzania, where the coffee farmers have sold some of their coffee on fair trade terms, it gives them the confidence to go into the auction house and actually hold out to push the price higher, because they know they've got some containers sold on a fair price. They take a few more risks that help push up the coffee price in the auction for all the farmers. And so we can see in many cases that wider impact spreading. However, fair trade clearly has no magic wand. The risks of selling products on the market in many cases, of course, remain. Many, many problems that the farmers face are still there. Fair trade gives them access to information, to markets, to networking opportunities, to the possibilities to be strengthened and to build up their capacity, particularly in collaboration with the 100% fair trade organisations like Cafe Direct or Divine or Tradecraft or your very own Equal Exchange here in Edinburgh, who's ready to work with and invest in the farmers and their organisations. But of course, so many difficulties still face the farmers every step of the way, including, of course, inequalities between men and women. And if you look back at the academic research, in fact, there has been very little gender analysis of the impact of fair trade. And that which there is very varied. Just to take a few figures for a minute, among the smallholder organisations, 24%, about a quarter of the members are women. It's higher in some products like tea or cotton, where it's more like 30%. But still, the overwhelming majority of the members of the cooperatives are men, and women are definitely participating less. And that's obviously in particular the case because these are export crops sold for cash, which have very much been traditionally the preserve of men. On the plantations, something like 4 out of 10 of the workers are women. It's higher on some plantations like tea or flowers, which are very dominated by women workers, but it's much lower in others like bananas, where very much it's considered men's work. And the impact that fair trade has had then depends on a number of factors. It depends most obviously, of course, on the relative strength of prevailing gender norms in those countries. So if you meet fair trade farmers in Belize, actually they're celebrating just recently because finally 2 women have got elected to the National Fair Trade Committee, battling against any numbers of hurdles to overcome. If you go to Nicaragua, on the other hand, you will meet the most feisty women you've ever met anywhere, who match anyone here in Edinburgh for fighting for women's rights. And indeed, coming out of the revolution, it was very much women who were in the forefront of organising farmers, organising the coffee farmers. They've set up a women's coffee network, and indeed you can buy their brand of women's coffee in Nicaragua itself. And they are extremely active in supporting women farmers, enabling them to lead the cooperatives, as well as enabling them to ensure that their children and grandchildren are able to go to university for the first time. And the relative involvement of women also depends on the extent to which it is an export crop, and it's a crop that's traditionally been dominated by men. And indeed, many of the studies found that even when men are still very much in the stronghold over the commodity that's actually exported, the coffee, for example, or the sugar, that women have often been involved in using the premium to diversify, to set up, for example, bakeries, some of the women's groups, to diversify their income using the capital that they get through the fair trade premium, using that to enable them as women to diversify as a bakery, as vegetables, setting up tourism sometimes, processing the crops for the first time, doing handcrafts, other ways that they can build up their economic sources. Of course, it's also different when the women are workers, and there we can see very direct impacts. For example, improved maternity rights for women workers on flower farms have dramatically transformed their possibilities, with them getting really now leading maternity rights, not only in Africa, but in fact right across the world. And indeed, the managers are always complaining that as a result, the women are having many more and more babies in order to benefit from the increased maternity rights. And it also, of course, depends on the extent to which the cooperatives have explicit policies and strategies targeted at women or not. So, to give one example, there's a study by Ronchi of a cooperative in Costa Rica called Cu Café in 2002, which found that actually only 20% of the members were women. And that actually those women that were becoming members were doing that to enable the whole family to have access to credit. But they themselves didn't have time to regularly go to the meetings because of their childcare and domestic responsibilities. And so women were consistently turning down the opportunities to participate in management. And some of them also didn't even feel able to participate or their husbands were against it. As one woman said, the women in the co-op have a vote, but they don't have a voice. Now, when Coup Café realized that, they took action to see what could they do about it. And so they set up concrete actions to seek to promote women's empowerment. Among the most successful was an educational grant they set up called Sons of the Farmers, which has a special affirmative action policy towards scholarships, making sure that the women and the girls in particular get the opportunities to go into higher education. But they found it was harder to encourage the village-level cooperatives to follow up that same kind of proactive policy for women. So yes, if you call a meeting of the Fairtrade farmers and workers, the majority will be men. But you know what? If you call a meeting of the leaders of Britain's supermarkets or major manufacturers with whom we're working on Fairtrade at this end of the supply chain, do you know what? The majority will be men. I think there is one woman leading a FTSE 100 company in this country. And so, yes, there are men dominating throughout the supply chains, from the farmers right through to the leaders of our supermarkets here. But there are also those 100% fair trade companies led by some pretty feisty women. Whether you look at Divine or Café Direct, at People Tree or at Bishopston, at Bubbles and Balm or Missionary Soap, there are more and more women interested in thinking, how can we take forward another model of doing trade that puts people first and that also puts women first. And we in the fair trade movement realise the challenges that this gives to us, the need to put women first. And so we've beginning to lay out a programme over the coming years of what can we do to best support the farmers and ourselves address some of those imbalances. We need first, as the research has shown, to collect more information on the impact of fair trade for women and looking at it from a gender perspective, and that can help inform our standard setting and see if the fair trade standards need adapting or changing in ways that will better support women. We need to develop more gender-sensitive impact stories and best practice examples so that the farmers can share them with each other, that examples of where women have managed to create change in one co-op can be shared with women farmers in another co-op. We need to look in our own certification and training and our support for producers. What can we do better to make sure that we're working as well as we possibly can with the women? And how can we make sure that that gender perspective also informs our work as we work to develop new products, open up whole new areas to fair trade, and also to work with new and different kinds of producer setups, so that women are not just benefiting from fair trade, but are increasingly having a voice and a say and being recognised and indeed owning their own businesses. As when we went round to meet some of these women farmers in Rwanda recently, I actually asked one of them, well, what's your dream? What do you dream of? And one woman spoke up and she said, first of all, she said her dream was to have a cow, because if she could save enough to buy a cow, she could give milk to her children, but she could also sell the milk. And then another one piped up and said, my dream would be to have women's fair trade coffee from Rwanda on sale in Britain. So that, because she said, we do all the work and we get none of the recognition. So wouldn't it be great to have a fair trade women's coffee that you could buy here? But obviously those dreams are only possible if we can open more doors to more farmers to sell their products on fair trade terms. And indeed, as the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, said, fair trade offers new opportunities for small-scale producers in Rwanda, and we have made great achievements in this respect, especially in the coffee industry. As a country where most people depend on agriculture, we must figure out how to move faster in this direction in order to positively impact the economic well-being of rural communities. And that is why we are determined over the coming years to see how can we really scale up fair trade so we can work with the hardest to reach communities in countries like Rwanda or like Palestine, helping work with farmers in regions of conflict to build the economic underpinnings of peace, and to build an architecture of hope for the farmers, that people are aware that at the end of these long supply chain are farmers and workers who want a fair deal, and seeing how can we increase the opportunities for them to sell more of their products on fair trade terms. But we can only achieve more of that if we can grow the market more. That farmers can only sell their products on fair trade terms if more of us buy them. And that's where the role of the grassroots social movement comes in, and the University of Edinburgh can hold its head proud for all that you've achieved in spearheading that movement. The first university in Scotland to achieve fair trade status, one of the first in the country, and still in the forefront of leading that movement to see how can we take fair trade out to the communities. And today we have over 470 fair trade towns. And in fact, next month we'll be celebrating 10 years of the Fair Trade Towns movement, which was started, a mad idea, started in Garstang as a way of connecting people in their local high street, hairdresser and estate agent and shop at a time, with the international movement to tackle poverty. And there are, as I say now, 468 fair trade towns, 114 fair trade universities. So that's quite a proud achievement that you were up there, in there, right at the beginning of a movement that continues to spread. Over 6,000 fair trade faith groups, including many synagogues and mosques, and just recently the first Hindu temple. And over 4,000 schools signed up to the Fair Trade School Scheme. And any of you who have worked with the children will know the absolute energy that kids have for fair trade and the way it enables them to connect with these big, vast global problems of injustice in trade. And in fact, I always used to say the future of fair trade is in safe hands because of the extent to which our kids get fair trade. But actually, Betsy, who leads the Scottish Fair Trade Forum, put me right today. Children aren't the future. They're today. They're the present. And I don't know how many times people have said to me, I've started buying fair trade coffee, chocolate, juice, bananas, because my sons and daughters told me about it. And I also know how significant that is for very many leaders of major retailers and manufacturing companies who, when we go to speak to them, often say, oh, my children keep beating me up for not offering more fair trade. So it's absolutely right, Betsy, to say that children are the present and they're helping drive that change, which means that today 72% of the public recognise the fair trade mark and understand it. And of course, sorry guys, but women have been in the lead all along those past 15 years. And in fact, today it is 77% of women who recognise the fair trade mark. That knowledge of fair trade has always been higher among women. And of course, women do still do most of the shopping. So it is good news that women are had the highest recognition of fair trade and the strongest support for it, and are absolutely ready to be out there in the forefront, campaigning for more shops to offer more fair trade products, buying them, putting them in their basket, and enjoying them when they get home, safe in the knowledge about the difference that it's making to the farmers and workers in developing countries. And indeed, it is with that kind of energy that I've seen today at the university with the workshop that was held, the energy and the passion that people have and the determination they have, that we can take fair trade further to the next stage, looking to see which other colleges or universities or towns in Scotland can help Scotland achieve its objective to becoming a fair trade nation, where really everybody has got behind this movement. And I don't like to mention it here, but of course it was Knox who spoke about the first blast of the trumpet, and I would say back to him that watch out, matey, because the monstrous regiment of women are on the march, pretty determined to put fair trade onto our shop shelves. And as Arundhati Roy said very beautifully, the Indian writer, she said, "Another world is possible. And if you listen very carefully, you can even hear her breathing." And I'm now going to end, if I can manage the technology in a very modern woman kind of way, to show you finally a quick, just a minute, DVD about the Big Swap, which was our big campaign this Fairtrade fortnight to encourage more and more people to swap to Fairtrade, 1,000,001 swaps, and to encourage more people to look for Fairtrade products, to buy them and to register it on our wacky swapometer. And we've actually got to 870,000 this morning, so we're very nearly there. So if I can encourage you, if you do nothing else, when you get back home, to put on your computer and register for the big swap, see if we can get to 1,000,001. Just think that one could be you, in order that we can really tip the balance in favour of farmers and workers in developing countries.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much indeed. That was informative, inspirational. It was a matchless inaugural lecture from this new series of Edinburgh University lectures. And it's now over to you. We've got 2 roving microphones. Even if you bellow, please wait for the roving microphone so that everybody in the hall can hear. There's one there and one there. If you put your hands up, can you keep them up so the roving microphones can see you and get to you? And while you're putting your words together, let me ask a question, which is, you highlighted the role that women play in production and trade and the challenges they still face. And can you say something about, and some of your planned stratagems for improving their lives? Where does this fit into the overall, I've got an A to Z of questions, ambition of Fairtrade?
Well, overall, we're very ambitious in the Fairtrade movement, and I think I can feel that ambition talking to people locally here in Edinburgh, and it multiplies at a global level. And our strategy, which I talked about, which is to tip the balance in favour of the farmers and workers, we've laid out a plan to see if we can enable 5 times the number of producers to sell 10 times as much of their goods by 2015. So it's 5, 10, 15. And within that, we've got particular strands. Can we, for example, really gain significant market share here in Britain, where I'm pleased to say we lead the world in fair trade? Why can't we make half of all our bananas or our coffee fair trade? Let's see if we can make that our goal in the next few years. And so then we've got particular targets for particular products. Then we're seeing how can we work with companies so they get really committed. Not that they do a little bit of fair trade, but like Scotmid, they really put it bang centre in all their business practices, making all their own label coffee or tea or sugar fair trade. And then to see how can we work with the hardest to reach farmers in, as I mentioned, least developed countries, countries in conflict. And I think it's as part of that that we've also been looking, how can we make sure we're reaching out to women in particular to enable them to participate more. And it's very much, I would say it's really early days that we feel able to have a strategy of how we can really, from the beginning, if you like, see that forward, as opposed to a coffee group comes in and starts working, and then they're looking at the involvement of women. And it's been in the fair trade standards for years about the involvement of women, but actually having something in the standards is not the same thing as actually being able to deliver it. So I think we're going to see it coming up our list of priorities over the coming years.
Yes. Could you keep it up so that keep your hand up rather, so thanks. Basically, if there are any gaps, I'm happy to fill in with my ABC of questions, but if anything occurs to you, stick your hand up, and there's one there. Thanks very much. Yes.
It's not really a question, it's just more a work for equal exchange. To say that we've been buying coffee from Uganda for many years now, and at the end of the summer we're bringing in coffee from women's co-ops only for the first time. So there will be a product out there.
Who's the we?
Equal Exchange from Edinburgh.
Thank you.
Check our website.
And can you put the microphone forward to the woman in the front and then to the woman in the back? Yes, over here. Can I just pause you for a second? Can you get that microphone up or on or... Try again. Try again. No, it's not. I tell you what, let's go to this lady just now and we'll sort out that microphone. Yes.
Are you concerned about the growing awareness of carbon footprint and food miles? Is that having a detrimental effect on the growth of fair trade here?
That was my C, actually, yes. Carbon footprints, yes.
And actually, at one level, it relates to the question. I think you said the women's coffee was coming from Uganda, did you? From Gumatindo, yeah. And it's just worth, and excuse me for those who were there this afternoon when we discussed it, if I repeat myself, I think it's really important that we discuss this. Firstly, I think there's actually no contradiction. People often say to me, well, shall I buy local or shall I buy fair trade? And, I know there's global warming, but really you can't buy much bananas or tea or coffee grown in Scotland yet. So clearly you buy local, the meat, the dairy, the vegetables, and you buy fair trade, all those products that we don't grow here, which in a way is a kind of buy local fair trade. It's about as close as you can get to the farmers on an international level. So I don't see a conflict, and in fact I see the reverse actually. We must tackle climate change and poverty, global poverty, and indeed war and insecurity in a coordinated way. And that's because, firstly, the fair trade farmers have been among the first, farmers in the developing world are among the first to feel the impacts of climate change. Climate change for us is a theoretical future worry about what's going to happen to us. The farmers are feeling it now. It was at Gumatindo that the coffee farmer last year found a 40% fall in their harvest because the rains have become completely erratic. It rains at the wrong time, it's sunny at the wrong time, it rains too hard. And indeed, just last week, one of the representatives of Gumatindo was touring Britain, Fiona, who is their standards manager, and I asked her about it, and she said just last week there was a mudslide in their villages because they had torrential rain out of season, and actually 80 people were killed, including the manager of one of the cooperatives. That's not unusual. More and more of the farmers are telling us that they're having more hurricanes, more mudslides, more devastating weather that's destroying their livelihoods. And yet these are the people who have the least resources to fall back on to try and cope with those kind of challenges. And they're the people in the world who have done the least to contribute to climate change. As Sir Nicholas Stern said, Africa has the moral authority on climate change. And to give you another example of that, it was John Kangageli is the very fantastic manager of a coffee cooperative in northeastern Tanzania, whose coffee you can buy in Cafe Direct. And when he was asked about this, he said, I wish you could visit my coffee farmers. We don't have one television, not one fridge or DVD or phone or fax machine. We don't have most of the farmers don't have a bicycle, let alone one car, let alone two. Most of the farmers have never been to Moshi, where the coffee auction is, let alone hopped on and off planes all their lives. Don't ask my farmers to clean up the mess that you in the West have created. And we should look at those bits of our lives and our livelihoods that have the biggest impact on global warming and where we can actually take action and perhaps restrain our livelihoods a little bit without impacting on the opportunities of some of the poorest farmers in the world to earn their way out of poverty. So to give another example, the average person in Kenya has a carbon footprint of 200 kilograms a year. Ours is 9,000. And in the USA, it's 21,000 kilograms a year versus 200 for the average person in Kenya. So it's very clear we need to look somewhere else about how we clean up our carbon footprint, whether it's through industry or the amount of electricity or the kind of lives we lead, while actually working with these farmers to enable them to mitigate and adapt to the effects of global warming.
Is this microphone now working?
I think so.
Yes.
What's the future for expanding fair trade economies, such as the competition seen between South American produced bananas and African bananas at the moment?
So I couldn't quite hear between. What's the first bit of your sentence? What's the
expanding economies of fair trade and the competition that will create?
Yeah. Okay, I don't know if I'm quite answering your question here. There has historically been a competition between the small farmers of the Windward Islands, who have had preferential access to the EU, and the big banana economies of Central America, where you get big plantations owned by the multinational companies very often. And that is absolutely, they've been struggling within the World Trade Organization for years. There has been a banana war going on. Bizarrely, the complaint in the World Trade Organization was taken by the USA that doesn't export one banana, but is of course home to Chiquita and the other big multinationals who export out of Central America. This battle's been going on forever, and in January they came to in December I think they came to another agreement, which is yet worse again for the small farmers of the Windward Islands, who are losing yet again any preferential tariff protection they used to get for access to their bananas to Europe. So the small farmers of the Windward Islands need our support now more than ever. Fairtrade has, as one farmer said, been the saviour of the Windward Islands. That actually, without fair trade, those 4 island economies would have been destroyed about 10 years ago, because it was becoming more and more difficult for them to compete with the very cheap bananas from Central America. And it's by coming into fair trade, actually all their bananas are now fair trade, all the banana farmers are organised in fair trade groups. And as it was the prime, it has been the saviour of the islands. Now they face the additional problem of having lost all their tariff protection. So they're trying to think, should they, for example, launch a campaign around Caribbean bananas again, to talk about the brand, the flavour, the smaller, sweeter bananas and the smallholders that lie behind it, and to because they know how much public support they had previously for campaigns around Caribbean bananas. And so they're trying to think, what are the best ways to do? But it's definitely a huge challenge for them to have to compete without that special protection.
So that's an ongoing work in progress. Absolutely,
and it's very much any ideas that people have about what could we do to particularly support them, to talk about the Caribbean bananas and the difference it makes, the importance for the farmers. It's one of the questions people always sort of say, well why don't they diversify? If only it was that easy. People have a kind of land and knowledge handed down through generations about how to grow bananas. And Boris Johnson put it rather beautifully, actually, speaking about some redundant steel workers once. He said, you can't wake up and start selling cappuccinos on the internet. You have particular skills and land and knowledge and access to markets, and it's a long, hard slog to diversify. though the Windward Island farmers are absolutely trying to do that, to sell Fairtrade limes and lemons, to move into pickles and actually sell their bananas to tourists on the cruise ships. So they're trying to look at all the different ways, but it's not easy.
Yes.
I know that everybody that's here is probably supporting Fairtrade, but quite often we are challenged by people who will say such things as the big supermarket brands that claim to be fair trade aren't the genuine article at all, that you have to be very careful, and actually if you donated the difference you would actually make more difference. Could you comment on those challenges that the fair trade movement get?
Well, to those particular two challenges, firstly about the supermarkets, or indeed big companies offering fair trade products, what we always say is, you can trust the fair trade mark because we trust nobody. We have a rigorous set of standards that we enforce as strictly whether you're Equal Exchange sitting in Edinburgh doing only fair trade, or whether you're a major supermarket. And if anything, we're stricter. The bigger the company, the more careful we are about enforcing and checking the rigour of our standards. There is no compromise. Whether a company is big or small, there's not room for compromise. The standards remain the same, with the minimum price and the premium as buying directly as possible from organised producers. And so I think that's the point of the fair trade mark, is that people can trust it. And overwhelmingly, actually, it has very strong support and trust among the public. People who recognise and know it, 9 out of 10 people trust the fair trade mark, and so they can feel reassured about that. We do, however, also need the big companies to do fair trade, because they bring the kind of volumes that can help tip the balance in favour of the farmers. And without those major companies and supermarkets, we would still be so small. And it's one of the biggest problems we have, is that farmers are often selling very low percentages of their product on fair trade terms, or they're queuing up to join the system and they can't come in unless more companies engage. To your second point, I was actually at a debate last week with somebody from the Adam Smith Institute who was, as you would expect, arguing against fair trade. And he said just this, actually. He said, well, what if you put, 10 pence more and gave it directly? And one of the farmers nearly exploded, actually, sitting next to me. He was just jigging to get up and say, we don't want charity. We don't want to depend on handouts any more than you do. We simply want to be paid a fair price for our crop and to be able to sell it on fair terms and to hold our heads up high. And indeed, again, just today, wasn't it, Jamil of the Palestinian olive farmers said exactly the same thing. He said, don't buy our product because you feel sorry for us. Buy it because it's the most fantastic olive oil. And you can be sure that we get a fair return. So I think this is a much bigger, longer-term project than charity. You sometimes need charity. Sometimes you do need. People have catastrophes coming out of Haiti, for example. There is a case for charity. But actually, if we're going to tackle poverty overseas, you have to go to the root causes. And the root causes are one of the root causes is unfair trade. And if we begin to tackle that, not only are you making a difference here and now to that 7.5 million farmer workers and their families, but you're helping change the whole atmosphere within which business is done. You're giving business permission to care, and you're saying to them, clean up your business supply chains and your business practices. And that's a very big long-term change and a long-term gain that goes actually even beyond the immediate benefit to the farmers. And many of the farmers groups say that to us. They say, don't just look at the percentages we're selling on fair trade terms to see the impact of fair trade. Look at what's on the agenda of business boardrooms. Look at the negotiating table when we sit round and see what's on the agenda. And that's bigger long-term change you don't get by giving 10p goes to charity to this group. You get it through making those changes among the public and among businesses.
Are you able to name names? I mean, does one supermarket stand out above the others? I know Sainsbury's, I know you don't have to answer this question, and Sainsbury's makes a great virtue of its fair trade credentials. What about Morrison's versus Sainsbury's versus Tesco versus Waitrose, etc., etc.?
Well, I think there's a bit of healthy competition at the minute, and I think you have to say, to give credit where credit's due, you have to give credit to Scotmid and the Co-op, who, as they proudly display on their lorries, have for a long time been the biggest supporters of fair trade, and particularly of the grassroots social movement, being ready to back local fair trade towns and schools and universities. And I'm sure goodness knows how many chocolate samples they've given away in the cause of raising awareness about fair trade. And Sainsbury's, on the other hand, is the world's largest retailer of fair trade now. They are selling now more fair trade goods than any other. And of course that then stokes the others to look back at them and think, well, we need to make sure that we're also in there. And maybe we're not going to be the leader if you're a Morrison's or an Asda, but you don't want to be too far behind. And actually what's interesting is people like Morrison's and Asda, they're the leaders in selling more fresh fruit than any other retailer, or Marks and Spencer's is leading on the cotton. So there's obviously areas where each of them can, and that's a bit of healthy competition that I think can only benefit.
Yes.
Can I say it's been fantastic to get the practical examples of how well fair trade is now actually growing. Every year we have a debate in the Scottish Parliament and we get more and more examples of really good local fair trade groups. Can I get a sense of how well we are doing compared with other countries? Are we leading the way? How do we get other countries to work as well? You had the fair trade comment about trading at a global scale. Is there more we could do to lobby in Europe to get other countries in Europe to become more fair trade orientated as well, to build that market, whether it's public procurement or whether it's companies changing? Because it's quite exciting to feel like as consumers and as representatives we've actually made a positive difference. And I think that's quite a powerful message. If you think about all the people that campaigned to make poverty history in Edinburgh, there's a huge mood to actually do something rather than talking about it. So it's quite exciting seeing on the screen what's actually happening to make a difference.
Thanks. And while you've got the mic, can you just pop it to the woman in front since she's there? I will come to you behind. Thanks.
Well, absolutely right. I think we can all feel very proud that Britain leads the way in fair trade and is incredibly inspiring to other people around the world. Wherever I go, people are saying, what is happening in Britain? It's incredible, and it's inspiring the grassroots social movement. So the Fair Trade Towns movement that started here has now spread right across Europe, and has now spread also to Australia, New Zealand, to the USA, to Canada, and indeed our colleague Bruce Crowther, who leads that, was just come back from Japan, thinking, well, can they start it there? Because it's clearly an idea that inspires and excites people and helps people connect between their community and the global issues. So we lead the way in the grassroots social movement and in the engagement of companies, both the cracking 100% fair trade brands that we have, but also the extent to which mainstream companies and retailers have taken fair trade to heart in this country is again leading the way. And that's again inspiring other retailers. So for example, Sainsbury's recently held a conference in London to which they invited retailers from right across Europe because they found they were getting called up every day by retailers in Europe thinking, well, maybe we can gain some competitive advantage by doing that. And so in the end they thought, oh, for goodness sake, all come and we'll talk about it all together in one place. So there's no doubt, whether you look at the grassroots social movement, the involvement of companies or retailers, Britain is leading the way in fair trade, which I think we can be proud of, and it's really exciting. On the other hand, it's only of value if we can use it to lead the movement globally. And as you say, that we can get that same levels of awareness and penetration and purchasing that we've got here right across Europe. And of course, the most important next market will be the USA. And after that, I hope in 10 years' time, the biggest fair trade market will be India. That we will increasingly work in countries where there are producers, but there are also big, rich middle classes who could buy fair trade. And indeed, we've already started fair trade sales in South Africa, so you can both buy it, and there are fair trade producers in South Africa. And I think, as I say, India will be the next big one. But to go to Europe, I think there is an enormous amount that actually the European Parliament could do to support and encourage fair trade, particularly in countries where it's still very weak, like Spain. Portugal, it's non-existent. Greece, it's non-existent. Italy, it's very weak. So these are still some major economies where some support from Europe would really help. And absolutely, procurement must be one of those most effective ways that government can put its weight behind fair trade and indeed follow the lead of the people, really. I think it's 18% of our GDP is public procurement. Obviously, lots of that is wood and all kinds of things that are nothing to do with fair trade yet, but an enormous amount of tea must be drunk by all our squaddies, and an enormous amount of cotton must be used in the sheets and the towels within the NHS or within any catering establishment. And so I think any support on how we can also lobby for local and central governments, as well as institutions like universities, to get behind the public procurement absolutely would be fantastic.
Thank you. There's a mic somewhere back there, yes.
I was delighted to hear that Fairtrade is helping Palestinian farmers sell their produce. I was wondering, though, if that's an economic issue only, or if Fairtrade also has to and does assist with overcoming non-economic barriers which are put in their way in Palestine or in other conflict zones.
Thank you. And can I just say to people that we are ending at 6:45. I know there's sort of a dribble effect because people have got to be somewhere, but we will be ending at 6:45 on the nail. Thank you. And there was another hand up there. Yes, that woman. Hello? No. Hand up. Thank you. There, yeah. Yes.
Absolutely, you're right. The farmers face any number of barriers, of which the economic is often just one. To give you a classic example was that actually Malawi is a country very dependent on exporting groundnuts. They used to huge importance to the economy until the EU put in particular regulations about aflatoxin, it's called, which they made it like 1 billionth particle of this tiny little microbe was in the groundnuts, meant you couldn't export your groundnuts to the EU anymore. Absolute catastrophe, destroyed the groundnut industry in Malawi, which is one of the poorest countries in the world. In fact, it's so poor, life expectancy is 39. And then thousands of farmers lost their livelihoods and the government lost income overnight because of the ridiculous rigour of those standards. So in a case like that, what happened is the farmers group is working together with companies and retailers from here to work with the farmers on seeing how could they prevent any aflatoxin being found in their groundnuts. And in that case, they discovered what happened was when you shell the groundnuts, it's really hard, so your fingers get really sore. So what they were doing was they were soaking the nuts to make the shell softer so they could shell them quicker, and it was that dampness that was possibly leading to this 1 billionth aflatoxin risk. So what they've done is they bought a hulling machine, so now they hull them by machine, and that's reduced their risk of being banned from the EU. That's one of a million examples of the way all the time companies are having to work with the farmers to help them overcome the barriers to trade.
Over in the front.
My question is about economics as well, to be honest. And I have to be honest, till about a year ago, I wouldn't have known fair trade until I fell over it. In all the years that fair trade's been going, I've been living in Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Papua New Guinea, and all these countries, and I have seen what small farmers have been up to. To be honest, my husband's work is in development and environmental concerns. We watched one project, and it's about vanilla beans. In Papua New Guinea, the people that were growing the beans are in very remote places. There was a market, and a European market was actually buying the vanilla beans. It didn't take too long before the actual price that they had been contracted to sell their vanilla beans for, right, didn't make economic sense. So in a way they showed creativity by actually threading the vanilla beans with wire, so the beans were heavier, and so when they were sold or went to market, your 1 kilo of vanilla beans was actually quite spectacular. They, in turn, of course, that wrecked the market. That really did. The companies that were buying for the West immediately went in there, damage control, tried to actually help them sort it out and put them back online. It didn't really work out because the bottom line was the money. They weren't getting enough money for their beans. The vanilla pods. And so the big companies and the smaller companies and the tiny little companies with the best will in the world backed away from it. and the Chinese came in and would buy the lot, no matter what, put it through a machine, remove the metal, and the end of that particular process in Papua New Guinea. So my question is, how does fair trade actually set prices for their products?
Thank you.
Well, the way we set the minimum price is through multi-stakeholder discussion. That's the first key point. That we sit around the table with producers, with traders, with independent experts, and work out what would seem to be a price that, first of all, covers the cost of sustainable production. So looking at the research, talking to the farmers about what it costs them to grow the crop, and looking at any research that's available, and taking that as our baseline, so you don't go below the cost of sustainable production, but also then looking at the market and thinking, well, how much above the cost of sustainable production can you also go, and making sure that the farmers always have the premium, that extra that they can invest in building a better future for tomorrow. And so at the heart, it's a process of research and discussion and negotiation with the experts within that industry. Now, the fair trade price is always a minimum price. If the market price goes higher, you have to pay the market price plus the premium. It's when the market goes to hell and back, then the minimum kicks in as a floor price and you get the minimum and the premium. So with the combination of the two, where the market's high, you're getting the premium, or if it's low, you're getting the minimum price. So the differential between fair trade and the conventional market varies enormously because the conventional markets fluctuate so wildly. In West African cotton farmers, they're getting something like 80% more with fair trade. In another case, the differential might be quite small. It might be just the premium. So it's relatively smaller. So it really varies depending what's happening in the market. But there are any numbers of problems in every commodity, and I don't think for 1 minute that fair trade claims it can be a solution to all the issues dogging world trade. But it is one very powerful tool at our disposal to make a difference to those farmers, to build that movement and that consumer consensus that also gives a mandate to the government to make some of the changes they need to make in world trade talks, and to open the space for us to begin to tackle these problems in trade through many, many different ways that will be needed.
The woman who's got it there. There's a woman who's got them. Yes. Keep going.
I can repeat the question.
Keep going. No, it's not. So hang on to it. We'll sort it out again. We'll take it. I'll go to this woman just now. Thank you.
I just wonder, what's the UK government's policy to fair trade? Also, does it mean have to pay less tax, important tax? So is that fair for the other countries' farmers? For example, if you importing cotton from China, it's more expensive to importing cotton from China than cotton from Africa from fair trade. Is it positive discrimination? Sorry, I have two questions.
Oh, well, I think I only got the first question. Is it positive discrimination about taxing? What was the other one?
Yes, I think basically the same.
Okay. No, you get no tax advantages at all for fair trade. Some people in some crops have sometimes said, why don't we lobby for that? Why don't we see if that will be one solution to some of the difficulties we face to try and have tax advantages? But actually, that would be, most likely, that would be seen as illegal under the World Trade Organization rules, which say you cannot discriminate between two products on the basis of the way they're produced. So there are no tax advantages for doing fair trade. And I think it would probably not be a campaign worth pursuing, because the risk would actually be you'd end up being taken to court by the World Trade Organization, and you'd actually risk pulling down the whole of fair trade for the possible gain of some tax. So I think it would be better not to campaign for a tax differential. So all the products face many, many different tax regimes, depending which countries they come from, on the different arrangements in place, whether they're a least developed country, or depending on the common agricultural policy. So each product has differences in the taxing regime, but it's the same for fair trade or non-fair trade.
Thank you. I'm going to take the last two questions and ask you to answer, because we've got to finish on time. So try again, see if it's working.
Okay. Yeah, my question was about big companies like Nestle getting the fair trade mark on products. And it's fantastic, the exponential growth in fair trade, but how do the public distinguish between a company that has a terrible track record of human rights. And now I heard an MSP last week saying, isn't it fantastic that Nestle is fair trade? And how do you, as the Fairtrade Foundation, monitor that so that, should there be different levels of fair trade marks so that companies who are instilled in fair trade, the Divine, the Cafe Directs, the people, the equal exchanges, whose whole ethos is in fair trade, have a higher recognition somehow than companies who perhaps are just coming in to try to jump on the bandwagon, perhaps?
Yeah, thank you. There's sort of a portmanteau question. Hold that one. And yes, finally.
Thank you. My question is about subsidies. Most developed countries do provide subsidies to their farmers, unlike developing countries. And this means that the quality of the products from developing countries are actually lower. They fetch very low prices, and also they can't compete at the international market. So my question is, what effort does your organization or Fairtrade has in place to address the issue? Thank you.
Thank you.
If I start with that question, absolutely, we agree that there are many very unfair subsidies that the rich world gives to farmers. For example, historically, sugar farmers in this country got enormous subsidies, and it was very difficult for farmers in Paraguay for example, or Malawi, to export their sugar to this country. However, we have begun to see some changes, for example, in sugar, and that's really opened the possibilities for the fair trade sugar farmers. And I absolutely think part of our campaign for fairer trade is also about saying we need to change world trade rules as a whole. We need to end the subsidies that are given to sugar farmers or the US cotton farmers. We need to end the escalating tariff that means you pay more if a product's more processed when it comes in. We need to absolutely push the governments, the MSPs, the MPs, the MEPs to actually put the Doha Development Round back on track in the World Trade Organization. And I think what fair trade does in that way, firstly, the growth of fair trade, the strength of public support is a very clear signal to government. It's giving them a mandate to go and take those big, bold, difficult decisions in the World Trade Organization, to bat, not just for Britain, if you like, but actually to bat for a fairer world trading system. The public are clearly saying they want it, and they need to take that and go and fight for it. And I think in this election year of all years is a wonderful opportunity to make sure that anyone standing for election hears that message, that your support for fair trade and actually your support for all trade to be made fairer, which must be done also through the global trading system. To come to the question about big companies, and people often say to us, well, aren't they just jumping on the bandwagon? And I sort of think, well, that's why we created the bandwagon. So they could jump on, because the whole point was not to remain a tiny niche of just a few companies bought by a handful of people. It is absolutely, in the end, to change all trade with developing countries. And so we need to engage both with the small pioneer brands and make sure that they're still out there in front, blazing the trail, engaging more deeply with the producers, finding new ways so that, for example, the olive oil that comes from Zaytun and Equal Exchange is also bottled in Palestine, going that next stage and adding value, but that you also have the big companies engaging. Because although there are many, many people who may not like some of the big companies, there are also many, many people who buy their products in vast amounts every day. And KitKat, for example, by going fair trade, it's opened opportunities for some of the poorest farmers in the world in Côte d'Ivoire, which again is one of the poorest countries, just coming out of a really very vicious conflict, a country very much on the edge, and where the cocoa farmers are very, very poor. 95% of the members of Cavaquivo, whose cocoa is in the KitKat, 95% of them are illiterate. There are no hospitals, there were no hospitals for 30 miles until those farmers actually put in an ambulance driver so they could take farmers to a hospital, and then a health centre. And they actually reckoned that last year that saved 30 lives, the fact that they had those kind of facilities for the first time. But they were selling tiny percentages of their cocoa on fair terms before. Now they can sell all their cocoa on fair terms, and the sugar in the Kit Kat is also coming from fair trade farmers in Belize. So I think it's absolutely vital that we work also with the small companies and with the big boys. And indeed, we begin to feel, you can begin to feel you could really impact the whole cocoa industry once you have some of these major players behind you. They can no longer dismiss fair trade as a nice little niche, but we'll get back to business over here. You begin to feel everyone in the cocoa industry is running around looking at their supply chains for the first time ever, that they've really had to focus back on paying a fair price to the cocoa and the sugar farmers. So I think it's an absolute testimony to the grassroots movement that these big companies are now engaging with fair trade. And indeed, that's what Cadbury said when they launched Cadbury Dairy Milk as fair trade. And one of the best things was they first did Cadbury Dairy Milk in this country about a year ago, and they were completely overwhelmed by the response. So the CEO, who normally gets, really boring papers about finances and share prices and things like that, suddenly found that his inbox was full of those lovely sort of purple glittery cards that say thank you or well done that you give your son when they pass their GCSE or their driving test. And the public were writing to Todd Stitzer saying, well done for going fair trade. And as a result of that, they very quickly rolled it out. So they started with UK and Ireland. They're now going to make Cadbury Dairy Milk fair trade in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada and Japan. Because they got such an overwhelming response from the public, they thought, well, this is great. And they rolled it out. And they will say time and time again they've done it because it's a testimony to ordinary people who wrote to them and asked them and who they got bored of replying as why they never did fair trade. So I think it's an enormous compliment to the movement that the companies are doing it. The campaigners will go on supporting the 100% fair trade companies. And we at the Fair Trade Foundation are always working with the companies to see what more can we do to support them. They pay a lower license fee, for example. What more can we do to particularly highlight their work and their products in our PR, on our website, in our marketing? What other ways can we work together to support those companies so they survive and prosper, while we also bring in some of the big power brands who the public just won't leave. They love fair trade, but they say, if only my favourite brand would do fair trade. And so we take them with us too on the journey. So really, at the end of the day, more farmers in countries like Côte d'Ivoire can sell more of their products on fair trade terms.
We're out of time. Thank you very much for your questions. Thank you to the roving mic wielders, and many thanks to Harriet. And hang on a moment.
So four quick thank yous. First of all, thank you to the audience for coming to celebrate International Women's Day and for your excellent questions. Thank you to the organisers, Vice Principal Lorraine Waterhouse, Denise Boyle, Deepsy De Silva Williams and other colleagues. That was absolutely excellent. Really superb chairing from Sheena. Thank you very much indeed. And special thank you to Harriet. Harriet explained to us why fair trade is needed, and explained it in very clear but a very compelling way. She explained the mechanisms around fair trade, and she interleaved the narrative with the very particular and important role of leading women in the development and the continuation of the fair trade movement. So please join with me in applauding Harriet.
This production is copyright the University of Edinburgh.